"Good afternoon. May I take your order?" The girl, her name tag read Clara. She smiled, but Alexander noticed the corners of her lips didn't rise evenly. The right side lifted more than the left. A clear sign of someone trying to act okay. 2 signature burgers. 1 large fries. "Oh." He paused deliberately. "Are the fries crispy today?" A brief hesitation. Barely noticeable, but enough. "Why, yes, they are." Alexander needed no further confirmation. Her hands said everything. Tense, slightly trembling, pressing the keys like she might snap them. And her eyes, they shimmered with tears that never fell. Someone afraid to be noticed, yet silently crying out for help. He said nothing more, took the tray, and led Leo to a windowside table. It took him 3 minutes to assess all exit routes, locate the security cameras, identify which employee kept glancing at Clara, and notice the man in the white shirt sitting in the corner, staring at a phone that had been off the whole time. "I'm going to the restroom, stay here," he said. But Leo was already too absorbed playing with his plastic spoon to respond. Alexander didn't walk straight to the restroom. He turned left. Slow steps. Rubber soles made no sound. And then he heard it. A man's voice. Low, sharp, weaponized. "You think you're important? I could replace you tomorrow and no one would care." The employee break room door was slightly ajar. Alexander didn't peek. Not yet. He stood off to the side, tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning ahead. No one noticed. Clara's voice came next, choked, like pulled from deep within her throat. I'm trying my best." No one says, "I'm trying my best," unless they've been pushed to the edge. No one trembles like that over a normal reprimand. Alexander pulled out his phone. Hit record. Silent. Cold. Because he wasn't just a customer. He came here for a reason. And today, that reason finally had a voice. The midday sun blazed down on the bustling streets of Hamburg. The aroma of lunchtime food drifted through the air, following the footsteps of office workers, laborers, and families flocking to nearby eateries. Among the crowd, a man stepped out of a silver sedan, his gaze fixed on the red and yellow sign above the glass door of a restaurant, Vaughn's Burgers. Alexander Vaughn pushed his sunglasses up the bridge of his nose, his sharp eyes narrowing, not because of the sunlight, but because of something more ambiguous. This was one of hundreds of locations in the restaurant chain bearing his name. But today, he wasn't here as the CEO. Today, he was just a customer. Beside him stood his 10-year-old son, Leo Vaughn, fidgeting and tugging at the hem of his t-shirt. "Dad, can I get the large fries today?" Alexander chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Let's see if the fries here are even worth it." They walked inside. The scent of freshly grilled burgers mingled with frying oil and cleaning products, a familiar smell Alexander had known for decades. The restaurant was crowded, every table filled, the cash registers ringing steadily, the kitchen running like a well-oiled machine. But something felt off. Alexander had visited countless restaurants, his own and his competitors. He knew what a well-run location felt like. Here, the atmosphere was thick. The staff moved quickly but without ease. No one smiled. No one chatted. There was only a quiet tension, an invisible weight hanging in the air like a heavy fog. His attention shifted to a young woman behind the counter. Her name tag read Clara. Her tone was polite, her speech precise, but her eyes couldn't lie. "Welcome. What would you like to order?" Alexander smiled, just like any regular customer. 2 special burgers. 1 large fries. "By the way, are the fries crispy today?" Clara hesitated for a brief moment. "Why, yes, they are." Not an answer, more of a defense. As she handed over the receipt, Alexander noticed her hands tremble slightly. Her fingers gripped the register tightly, as if one small mistake might bring the whole world crashing down. He and Leo chose a table by the window. The boy played happily with a plastic spoon while Alexander silently observed. Everything seemed to be functioning well, but it was all surface level. He could sense something beneath it, something that made the air feel so tense you could cut it with a knife. "I'm going to the restroom for a bit. Stay here, okay?" Alexander said as he stood. But he didn't head straight to the restroom. He walked slowly toward the back of the restaurant where the staff area was. The noise from the dining area faded, replaced by hurried whispers behind closed doors. And then he heard it, a sharp male voice. "You think you're that important? I could replace you tomorrow and no one would care." Alexander stopped, leaning slightly toward the staff break room's partially open door. I'm doing my best, Clara's voice responded, trembling but restrained. Your best? Your best is still a mess. One more mistake and I'll cut your shifts. Let's see if you can survive that. Silence. A heavy pause fell like a curtain. Alexander clenched his fist. He knew men like this, managers who abused their power to intimidate staff. He had fired more than a few in his career. The name of the manager came to him, Victor Kessler. Alexander didn't know Victor personally, but through internal reports and vague employee feedback, he had a clear enough picture. And now he knew he'd made the right call coming here unannounced. When Alexander returned to the table, Leo was still smiling, happily munching on fries. But his father's demeanor had changed. His eyes were cold. He was no longer a customer. He was the man who would get to the bottom of this. The afternoon light streamed through the large windows of Vaughn's Burgers, casting golden streaks across the floor. Alexander Vaughn sat in silence, his hands interlaced, his gaze seemingly fixed on the stream of customers coming and going, but his mind was elsewhere. Behind a closed staff room door, the grating voice of Victor Kessler still echoed in his head like the sting of a blade not yet withdrawn. Leo whispered, "Dad, are you okay? These fries are really good." Alexander smiled at his son, gently ruffling his hair. "Yeah, they're good, but I think this restaurant needs a checkup." Soon after, a server emerged with their tray. Not Clara. It was a young man with tired eyes and hurried steps, as if trying to outrun something inside himself. He placed the tray down and murmured, "Sorry for the delay." Alexander nodded, not blaming him. But as the server turned to leave, his eyes sharpened. The tray was slightly wet, the wrappers misaligned, the burgers uneven. Not the standard he had built his brand upon. He knew he had to act. 30 minutes later, Alexander leaned over to Leo and said, "Stay here for a few minutes. I need to speak to the manager." Leo nodded. "Like that time in Lion?" Alexander smiled. "Exactly." He rose and walked straight to the front counter. Clara was processing a payment, her face stiff. She flinched slightly when she saw Alexander approach. Hello. Is there anything else I can help you with, sir?" Alexander leaned in, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "I'd like to speak with the manager. Now." Clara looked nervous. "Mr. Kessler is currently in the stockroom." "I'll wait. Call him. Now." His tone wasn't loud, nor threatening, but it carried a pressure Clara couldn't describe. She nodded and quietly picked up the internal phone. Less than a minute later, Victor Kessler appeared. Wrinkled shirt, tired eyes, trying to maintain professional confidence. He didn't recognize Alexander. "Good afternoon. I'm the shift manager. Is there an issue with your order?" Alexander turned to face him fully, locking eyes. "I'm Alexander Vaughn." No further explanation was needed. Victor's face drained of color, as if doused in ice water. He stammered, Mr. Vaughn. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. You didn't need to." Alexander's voice remained steady. "I didn't come here to be recognized. I came to see how my employees are really doing." Victor opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but Alexander raised a hand to stop him. "I heard enough behind that door. I heard how you threatened an employee over a minor mistake. I saw the fear in their eyes. And I know this isn't the first time." The air around them seemed to still. Clara, still behind the register, looked pale. Other employees had paused, quietly watching. Alexander stepped closer to Victor, his voice low but piercing. "You seem to have forgotten that everything here exists because of people. Not burgers, not machines. People like Clara. And you've treated them like garbage." Victor stepped back half a pace. Alexander didn't need to raise his voice. The truth alone was sharp enough to make a man retreat. "You are suspended immediately. A review team will be here within 24 hours. If we find evidence of abuse, misconduct, or exploitation, you'll never work in this company again." Victor was speechless. Alexander turned to Clara. "What time does your shift end today?" 8 p.m., sir. You'll clock out early today with full pay. Starting tomorrow, you'll report directly to regional HR. I'll personally oversee the restructuring of this location." Clara blinked, struggling to believe what she'd just heard. Thank you, sir. Alexander nodded and stepped away from the counter. Leo stood up from their table, looking at his father as if he had just watched a real-life superhero in action. The boy whispered, "Dad." "You made them go completely silent." Alexander smiled and took his son's hand. "Not to scare them, son, but to remind them that respect isn't a privilege. It's the baseline." 3 days later, Vaughn Holdings headquarters, Berlin. The conference room on the 15th floor was silent. On the main screen, an internal report had just appeared, a list of branches with abnormally high resignation rates over the past 6 months, anonymous complaints, and revenue reports showing sudden spikes followed by unexplained drops. Alexander Vaughn sat with arms crossed, his gaze sharp as steel, locked onto Felix Braun, the regional operations director for Northern Europe, the man directly overseeing branches including Hamburg. "Felix, I need an explanation. Why are HR reports from 4 branches, Hamburg, Bremen, Dusseldorf, and Leipzig, missing data on actual working hours?" Felix was sweating. He knew there was no way to dodge this. "We assumed it was a system glitch. The IT department said it might be due to software updates not syncing properly." Alexander cut him off, his voice low but cutting. "For cities, the same glitch. For 6 months. And conveniently, they all have mid-level managers who were internally promoted? Not a single audit scheduled." Silence settled over the room. Alexander took a deep breath and brought up the next slide, a short, secretly recorded video. In it, an employee at the Bremen branch complained about being forced to work extra shifts without pay because the manager said to underreport hours to stay within budget. This was submitted by a former employee. "And I don't believe Hamburg is an isolated case. This is a systemic pattern of abuse." He turned to Sebastian Reeve, the chief legal officer. "I want a full internal investigation. No advance notice. Focus on branches with high turnover, managers appointed without open recruitment, and branches with suspiciously high sales surges." Sebastian nodded, typing rapidly into his laptop. Alexander fixed his gaze on Felix. "Is there anything you want to disclose before I let legal dig in themselves?" Felix swallowed hard but tried to stay composed. I wasn't aware the managers were doing that. They have full autonomy over shift assignments. I only oversee performance metrics." Alexander cut in. "Performance doesn't excuse willful blindness. From now on, I'll personally oversee all regional manager evaluations and recruitment systems." That evening, Alexander sat alone in his office, the lights off, the only glow coming from his screen, a dashboard tracking shift data and incoming complaints. He knew this pattern well. He had seen it before during his early days managing for an international hotel chain where everything was hidden under the guise of operational efficiency and cost optimization. But now it was happening inside the very system he had built. A notification popped up from the communications team. An anonymous post just surfaced on an HR forum. "I was exploited at Vaughn's Burgers in Dusseldorf. No one believed me. But now I see someone's taking action. If the CEO really cares. I have proof." A link was attached. Alexander clicked. A folder appeared. _shadow_schedule.xlsx. _payslip_manipulation.mp4. _voice clip _meeting _April. He opened the audio file. A male voice, tense, furious, rang out. "If you don't like it, quit. There's 100 others out there who'll work for peanuts. If I'm paying someone here, they better know how to stay quiet." Alexander closed his eyes. The system wasn't rotting from age. It was being hollowed out from the inside. The next day, an internal task force was dispatched to investigate the flagged branches. Managers grew anxious. Some employees began submitting formal complaints with evidence. Alexander scheduled a private meeting with Clara Jensen, the cashier he'd first met in Hamburg, and invited her to join a new employee response team, offering additional training support as well. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes weren't filled with fear, but with hope. Elsewhere, in a dark office, Felix Braun pulled out his phone and called an old contact. "Listen, it's unraveling. He's planning to flip the entire system. But I've got copies of the data. If we release it first, with a different perspective, we might still steer the narrative." The voice on the other end replied coldly. "Then it's war." Berlin, headquarters, 20th floor boardroom. A 10-meter-long oak table stretched beneath the soft glow of premium overhead lighting. On the table, documents were arranged with surgical precision. Coffee poured at the perfect temperature. Everything was immaculate. immaculate in the way that suffocates. The Vaughn Holdings executive board sat in a neat row, less like innovators, more like auditors. At the head of the table sat Julian Whitmore, chairman of the board, the man who had helped Alexander build this empire from the early days. His salt and pepper hair, three-piece suit, and calculating gaze gave him an air of seasoned distance. To his right, Isabel Durant, global CFO, sharp-minded, pragmatic. To his left, Gregor Malden, strategic advisor, cold, quiet, and always 2 steps ahead. Alexander stood and placed the report on the table. For branches with evidence of timesheet manipulation, wage fraud, and staff intimidation, we have names, audio recordings, tampered payroll files, and both anonymous and signed complaints. Silence. He continued, voice clear and deliberate. I don't need another investigation to know this isn't isolated. This is what happens when we prioritize numbers over people. I'm proposing a full regional management restructure, including third-party audits, increased employee support budgets, and independent oversight. Julian sipped his coffee, eyes still on the report. Isabel broke the silence first. Alexander, I don't dispute your data, but are you aware of the cost of restructuring? We're still recovering from 2 consecutive losing quarters. This move could destabilize our stock. Alexander responded without pause. Nothing crashes a stock harder than a labor abuse scandal. You think the press will stay quiet when there's audio of staff being threatened? No. They'll destroy the reputation we've spent 15 years building. Only then did Gregor Malden speak, his voice cool and even, I agree the crisis must be addressed. But your approach is too loud. We need an internal solution, quiet, contained, one that won't rattle investor confidence or invite media frenzy. Alexander paused, then walked to the screen behind him and displayed a map. Every high-risk branch, color-coded by severity. He turned back, calm but firm. I'm not trying to make noise, but truth doesn't stay quiet forever. If we don't lead with transparency, someone else will force it on us in a much uglier way. Julian finally looked up. Their eyes locked, confronting founder. You're thinking with your heart, Julian said. No, Alexander replied. I'm thinking with my conscience. And this company cannot stand if we build it atop the muffled cries buried in our spreadsheets. Silence. Then Julian said, fine, I'll give you 30 days. 1 month to prove your model of HR reform can be both effective and transparent. If you fail, we revoke your operational authority and transition control to the strategic committee. A kind of ultimatum, not a threat but a message. Either you save the system or it replaces you. Alexander nodded. I accept. That afternoon, as he stepped out of the boardroom, Alexander received an anonymous message in his internal inbox. If you open full access to regional management data, you'll see some people on that board are not innocent. They don't want reform. They're afraid of exposure. Be careful, Vaughn. No signature. No return address. Alexander narrowed his eyes, reading the message one last time. He knew the next battle wouldn't be with middle management. It would be with the shadow behind him. Berlin, 2:14 a.m. The cold blue glow from the computer screen cast shadows across Alexander Vaughn's face. He had been in his office for 8 straight hours, alone on the highest security floor, access granted only to the CEO deep inside the heart of Vaughn Holdings global headquarters. A line of code had just finished running, internal_log_archive_v7_bremen.zip. The file didn't appear on the usual dashboards. It was deeply encrypted, marked temporarily deleted. There was no more doubt. Someone had manually erased portions of the work schedule logs, complaint forms, and internal reports and had done so from within the core data center. Alexander opened the file. Inside were chat excerpts between branch managers and several emails from an anonymous sender identified only as G.M Advisor. One of the restored emails read, from G.M Advisor to Victor.Kessler@vaughnsburger.eu. Subject, Special Operations Guidelines. No need to log shifts under 4 hours per day. Tag any employee labeled difficult. Avoid repeat patterns, rotate shifts. If a complaint is filed, use response form number 3, unable to verify data. GM. Alexander narrowed his eyes. GM, could it be Gregor Malden? No, Gregor was too careful to use such a traceable alias. But if GM Advisor was not officially registered, how had they issued operational orders to branch-level systems? He opened the internal security dashboard. Search term, GM Advisor. Result, no such user. A ghost account. Created, used, then wiped, leaving behind barely any trace. Unless Alexander activated the hidden logging tool, a backdoor function embedded in the earliest version of the system, something only he and Julian Whitmore had ever known about. He scanned for the most recent access to the Northern Region's management system. Result: IP address 17.94.67.21. Timestamp for 16 a.m. 3 days ago. Device Surface Pro 8 private encryption. Location Zurich, Switzerland. Strategic office Gregor Malden. Alexander leaned back in his chair. There was no longer any uncertainty. Gregor hadn't just known, he had orchestrated the whole thing. By 7:30 a.m., Alexander had summoned Sebastian Reeve, the company's head of legal, to his office. I have evidence that someone on the board is running a shadow system through hidden admin accounts, Alexander said. I want an internal investigation launched immediately, quietly. At the same time, I want all logs backed up before they catch on. Sebastian hesitated. You think Gregor Malden is involved? Alexander met his eyes. I don't think. I'm sure. He's at the center of this web. Sebastian sighed and nodded. In that case, we're no longer talking about mismanagement. This is a coordinated internal conspiracy. And if you want to expose it, you'll have to move fast. Very fast. Later that afternoon, an anonymous email arrived in Alexander's inbox. No threat this time, just an audio file attached. Meeting_recording_Zurich.m4a. He hit play. A voice he knew, measured, composed, and utterly cold, began to speak. Alexander is digging too deep. If he gets into the backup archive in Zurich, it all blows up. I don't care about his conscience. I care about stock price and my seat on the board. There was the faint clink of a glass. If necessary, we'll create a new scandal. Distract the media. Force him to resign, willingly or otherwise. Alexander clenched his fists. His breathing slowed, heavy with rage. This wasn't a management problem anymore. It was a coup in the dark. That night, he sent a single encrypted message addressed to the only person outside the system he still trusted. Elena Russo, I need a journalist unafraid of shadows. Meet me in Prague. 48 hours. No warning. No leaks. I'll bring the story and the proof. Prague, 10:14 p.m., a small cafe near the Vltava River. The season's first cold rain cast a misty veil over the surface of the river. Alexander Vaughn sat in a shadowed corner of the cafe, dressed in a dark overcoat, his eyes fixed on the door. Then she walked in. Elena Russo, the investigative journalist who had shaken Europe with her exposé on Swiss bank money laundering. Her hair was tied up, her face calm, eyes sharper than the winter sky outside. You're 2 minutes late, she said, without greeting. I'm being followed, Alexander replied, without smiling. Elena sat down and pulled out her notebook without another word. I've looked into Gregor Malden. Nothing remarkable. Nothing official. But when someone leaves no trace, that itself is the trace. Alexander placed a USB drive on the table wrapped in a plain brown envelope. This contains full access logs, internal emails, a ghost account called GM Advisor, and a recording from a closed-door meeting in Zurich. They're planning to push me out of the board, using dirty media if necessary. Elena raised an eyebrow. You want me to blow this wide open? No. Not yet, Alexander shook his head. I need you to keep it safe. And if, within the next 7 days, I'm suspended, lose access, or disappear, you release everything. As an independent investigation. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Do you understand what you've stepped into? I haven't stepped into anything. I've been inside it all along, I just hadn't admitted it until now. She nodded slowly. From now on, I'm watching. But understand this, if I see you compromise with them, I won't stay silent. Even if it costs you everything. Fair enough, Alexander said. 3 days later, Berlin headquarters. Alexander walked into his office and powered on his computer. A new email awaited him. From HR Board Oversight. Subject, complaint, abuse of power by CEO. An anonymous complaint has been submitted to the board accusing Mr. Alexander Vaughn of data manipulation, employee intimidation, and procedural interference during internal investigations. The board requests that Mr. Vaughn temporarily step down from executive authority for 72 hours pending verification. Alexander froze. They moved faster than he had anticipated. He immediately called Sebastian Reeve. "I've been suspended." "I know." Sebastian's voice was tense. The complaint came from an anonymous manager in Zurich. "I tried to access the feedback system, but it's locked under board-level encryption." Alexander slammed the desk. "This is their counterattack. They're using the same weapon I plan to expose them with: data." Sebastian sighed. "If you want to survive this, you need to bring out the evidence now. Otherwise, they'll turn public opinion and even your allies in HR will fall away." Alexander understood. This was the final hand. He pressed the call button for Elena Russo. "Release everything. Tomorrow morning. Simultaneously on print, digital platforms, and livestream. Not under my name. Attribute it to a senior industry source. Don't let them trace it back to me." "You're sure?" Elena asked. "There's no turning back." The next morning, across Europe. On the front pages of Le Monde, Süddeutsche Zeitung, The Guardian Digital. The ghost in the fast food chain, a system of exploitation hidden behind operational optimization. A network of senior managers using ghost accounts to manipulate work hours, falsify reports, and intimidate employees. Branch locations, responsible names, and encrypted emails made public. Vaughn Holdings board declined to comment. Stock prices plummeted. Media coverage exploded. Former employees began to speak out from Lyon, Oslo, to Krakow. A wave was forming. Later that afternoon, emergency board meeting. Gregor Malden entered the room, his face cold as ever. Julian Whitmore was already present, his hands never leaving his phone. Isabel Durant laid a color-printed news report on the table. "How do we respond to this? If it's true, we can't remain silent." Gregor answered calmly. "If someone leaked internal data, they are the threat. A company cannot function if its leaders can't secure loyalty." Julian remained silent, then finally spoke. "I've called Alexander to this meeting. Right now." The room fell into a hush. Alexander entered. Alone. No advisors. No lawyers. He placed an internal investigation report corroborating the press revelations on the table. Opened it. And said, "I'm not here to save myself. I'm here to save the company that you allowed to rot from within." Berlin, Vaughn Holdings headquarters, 9:46 p.m. The air in the 20th floor boardroom was thick like concrete. The executive board sat in a row, each with a report marked confidential. Outside, rain fell steadily. Thunder echoed faintly in the distance, like a countdown to an ethical bomb about to detonate. Alexander Vaughn stood in the center of the room, no podium, no presentation. Just one man facing a system that had once been his, now turning to judge him. Julian Whitmore, the founder and now chairman of the board, looked directly at Alexander. "You have 15 minutes to make your case." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He looked at each person in the room. Isabel Durant, sharp with numbers but lacking in heart, Gregor Malden, the silent strategist of manipulation, and the others, mostly passive, swept along by power, not principle. Then he spoke, no notes, no theatrics. "I'm not here to beg for my seat. I'm here to put you back in yours, the seat of those who must answer one question. How did we let this happen and let it continue for years?" He held up a file. "I have evidence that internal ghost accounts were created to orchestrate labor exploitation under the guise of performance. The access came from Zurich at the same time Gregor Malden was in that office." Gregor narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Alexander continued, placing a USB drive on the table. "This contains access logs and a recording of a private meeting where some of the people in this room discussed removing me from leadership using fabricated media narratives." Isabel spoke up, voice sharp as a blade. "And if this evidence is real? What do you want? A coup?" Alexander shook his head. "I want a reckoning. I want this board to understand one thing. If we don't fix ourselves, someone else will. And they won't be as kind." Julian gave a slight nod as if acknowledging that Alexander was on the right path. But then his eyes drifted to a newspaper on the table bearing Alexander's image and the headline, "CEO blows whistle on the exploitation machine he inherited?" Julian asked quietly, "Why did you take it to the media? Why not keep it in-house?" Alexander looked at him, not as a successor, but as a survivor of a decaying system. "Because the inside is already rotten. And silence is no longer a moral option." Gregor finally spoke, his voice even. "We cannot let emotion drive strategy. A CEO who destabilizes structure, crashes stock, and incites chaos. Does he deserve to lead our future?" Alexander met his gaze. "Strategy without ethics is just crime in a suit." And if I must choose, I'd rather lose money than lose our soul. Silence. Julian spoke slowly. I won't decide this alone. A vote will begin now. 10:28 p.m. Secret ballot. 11 board members. 1 vote each. On the screen, 2 options. Maintain executive authority with Alexander Vaughn. Transfer control to the Strategic Committee and suspend restructuring. One by one, the votes were cast. No words. No glances. The results appeared on screen, 7-4. Alexander won. The room stayed quiet. But it was the quiet of a turning point where masks no longer mattered and what had broken would have to be rebuilt, not with paper, but with stone. Gregor Malden rose, neither rushed nor angry. He removed his access badge and placed it on the table. I will resign. But don't think this is a final victory. A system that once rewarded silence won't easily coexist with a voice. Alexander said nothing. He simply watched the man walk out, the former spider at the center of the web, now retreating as his prey slipped free. 11:11 p.m. The boardroom door opened. Outside, the rain continued. Alexander stood alone in the corridor, looking out over Berlin by night. It wasn't the light of triumph. It was the light of a city that kept spinning, kept flowing regardless of who won or lost. And he whispered to no one in particular. We just saved a company from itself. But tomorrow we begin again with what it lost long ago, trust. 3 weeks later. Berlin, Vaughn Holdings headquarters. There were no longer bold red sales charts plastered across the meeting room. No more KPI alarms every Monday morning. On the wall of the strategy office now hung a new diagram simply titled Human First Grid. Alexander Vaughn stood before it, joined by Clara Jensen, now head of Field Insight, and Sebastian Reeve, the legal counsel. Each node on the grid represented a franchise connected by 3 guiding principles: transparency, safety, and equitable advancement. I don't need our branches to increase revenue over the next 3 months, Alexander said. I need them to increase the number of people treated with dignity. Clara, who once trembled behind a cashier counter in Hamburg, now replied with clarity and conviction. We've launched a witness line, a channel where employees can report misconduct, anonymously or openly. The system bypasses local management entirely. Sebastian nodded. We're also finalizing terms with an independent NGO to monitor mental health metrics and compliance with legal rest hours. Alexander picked up a small note from his desk, a message from an employee in Leipzig. I used to want to quit every day. Now I want to see what comes next. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. The following week, European FMB Industry Conference, Vienna. Alexander was the final speaker. There was no flashy backdrop, no animated visuals. Just a simple wooden podium and a single slide. We don't need to change the industry. We need to change the way we see people. He told the story of Hamburg, not glorified, not heroic. He spoke of Clara, of Elena Russo, even of Gregor Malden, for who they were: people, choices, and consequences. When he concluded, he said, "We once had a powerful system. Now we are building one that's trustworthy. And if any of you choose to restart, not with money but with truth, this industry still has a chance to become something worth being proud of." Applause didn't erupt. It grew, wave by wave, person by person. Not because he had won, but because someone had finally said what needed to be said. That evening, Berlin. Alexander's office. He sat alone. The room was quiet. His phone buzzed softly. A new email from Elena Russo. Subject: You kept your word. We just published part 2 of The Right to be Human, this time about the high-end retail sector in Milan. Looks like you opened a door most were too afraid to touch. I think this is only the beginning. Elena. Alexander looked out the window. The city still shimmered, but not as blinding as the night he first walked into Hamburg. The lights now felt more real, more human. And sometimes being human is the most luxurious thing a worker can hope for. He stood up and closed his laptop. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But not to defend a chair, to defend the people beneath it.